Kingdoms and States of Africa. The objectives are: 1. Analyze how the expansion of trade led to migration and the growth of new kingdoms. And 2, discuss the different forms of government introduced by rulers. Now, Ghana is one of the major kingdoms that emerges on the western coast of Africa. On the eastern coast, we saw the rise of places like Egypt, Kush, and Aksum. But on the west coast, we see the rise of a few other civilizations, but later than the others. Now, Ghana is the first of these, the first great real trading state in Western Africa that really emerges around 500 CE. Now, most were farmers, and they were living in villages, and really they lived under the authority of a local ruler, and the villages really formed the Kingdom of Ghana, a loose collection of different villages, all interconnected with a major king. But what they'll end up doing is taking great advantage of the trade networks that will begin to emerge right around this time. Now, we should not be ignorant of the fact that these people still need major water source, even though they're pushing into the Saharan desert. They'll be using the Niger River for most of the crops in that region. Now, really, under the kings of Ghana, we see the rise of strong rulers who really wanted to govern, but they governed without any true written law. They governed by their own might and own power. And we see this in early civilizations, early regions that begin to develop, and really the embodiment of true law is only centered around the person or aura of the king. So it allows for the king to, at any given moment, to say what he wants because he's king. Now, the Ghanaian kings then relied on really a well-trained, regular army of thousands of men to maintain their power. And this is really the center of their authority and the means by which they're able to maintain control over their subjects. Now, of course, Ghana lived off of the land, as many farmers did, but really prospered from their possession of iron and gold, these precious minerals that so many will really want. And particularly the issue of gold is going to be very important for Western African kingdoms. It will give them great power over most of Africa and their relationships with other foreign states as time goes on. Now, of course, this is only possible due to the fact that there are abundant supplies of iron ore and gold. Ghana was really located near one of the richest gold-producing areas, and even kingdoms after Ghana will take advantage of this. Now, it's inevitably Muslim merchants from North Africa that brought to Ghana really a bunch of metal goods that they themselves weren't able or hadn't produced. Textiles are as important. Horses is going to be incredibly important for transportation, not just the camel. And salt. Salt is so important for their survival. It was used really to preserve food. Think about the age they're living in. No refrigeration. Obviously in Africa, not a lot of ice or snow. You have, of course, improved taste. And this is an incredible, important idea for the preservation and improvement of meat. Now, meat is largely going to be consumed by elite, but nevertheless, this is going to drive a new economic condition and a new economic trade. Now, of course, other exports, other than gold, ivory, ostrich feathers, hides, slaves, all are commodities coming out of Africa that others want to purchase and buy. And that's really ultimately what drives the economy is the products or things that people want to trade, barter, or buy from the Africans. Now, much of the trade, of course, was carried on by Berbers. Now, these Berbers, whom had been later converted by Muslim invaders, were nomadic peoples, really who used camel caravans to cross the Saharan desert. And they went in great numbers, and often referred to as fleets of the desert, massive groups of camels and camel caravan trade that really was characterized by fleets of ships. So the tendency there of the Berbers to travel in great numbers lent to protection, really. That's the goal. You don't want to fall victim to raids and to bandits. But it's really, much of this trade is just fueled by the Berbers as they cross the Saharan desert, exchange whatever goods they have with the Africans, and then bringing it back to the north. Now, we end up seeing trading merchants really become incredibly wealthy. But by the 8th and 9th century, really we see all trade was conducted by Muslim merchants exclusively, perhaps due largely to the fact that so many in northern Africa had converted to Islam. And so really the northern African trade route becomes primarily controlled by Muslims. And so this leads to an interesting interchange in terms of trade between northern Christians and North African Muslims. Now, inevitably, we see the rise of another kingdom, the Kingdom of Mali, which is much later than previous kingdoms. Now, Ghana, of course, was really weakened by wars and collapsed in the 1100s. Usually empires collapse due to internal decay and external conflict, and really that's what we end up seeing. The state really established after Ghana was the Mali, which was set up by Soodiata Keita. And while I'm probably butchering the name, the idea was then that in this same space, new political leadership and new approaches to ruling emerge under this new Mali dynasty. Now, part of the idea here is that we have an emphasis and a new emphasis on shifting into a new economic condition. Sundiata was really considered the founder of the Mali. He defeated the Ghanaians as they really declined, and he seized the capital of the Ghanaian Empire in 1240. Much less an empire, more so a kingdom, but he created the famous trading city Timbuktu, which was the center of Mali wealth and power, really from all the gold and salt trade. He's going to bring the trade level and the wealth connected to that trade to the next level, as the world really is becoming much more interconnected after the medieval period. And you're seeing a global interconnection as particularly the Western palate is whetted for more spice and more exotic items. Now, inevitably, the most important person we need to talk about is the rise of perhaps one of the richest and most powerful kings ever, Mansa Musa. And he ruled from 1312 to 1337. And he created a strong, centralized government, really divided the kingdom into provinces ruled by governors whom he had appointed, so he could control them as they govern well in their own territories, which, of course, allows him to focus on big picture stuff rather than the individual micro-governing of particular problems in any given area. Now, he converted to Islam, and he ended up taking a pilgrimage to Mecca, which all Muslims are supposed to do. But his spread of gold really was what he's most remembered for, being incredibly wealthy and having so much gold. As he's heading to Mecca, he's just pouring out gold on the people in every place. And it's interesting because then what you end up seeing is that the markets themselves, where he's traveling, are flooded with gold. Particularly Egypt is flooded with gold, which is a problem. That's not a good thing. Even though people were excited when he's tossing out gold to people, it leads to inflation because there's so much gold that it doesn't have very much value. And so all of a sudden people are like, dang, I have all this gold, but I really can't buy much with it. It's not as wealthy as it was before you came. Now, inevitably, what he ends up doing is he creates a center of Islamic learning and cultural really center around Timbuktu when he returns. He fashions a great library. He fashions a school dedicated to the studying of the Quran and to writing. But inevitably, we see civil war really erupt and really divide Mali in 1359. And a new kingdom arises in that same space, the Songhai, and they emerge powerfully and really take over much of what the Mali had established. Now, of course, the reasons for the decline are really, in the big picture, the same sort of problems that we saw in other places: internal decay, external invasion. So that seems to be the pattern that we'll end up seeing. Now, the Songhai established themselves along the Niger River, and the Niger River really is an important river, just like many other river civilization. It floods and provides rich soil for raising of crops and, of course, then, therefore, raising of cattle. But the ruler Kossi converted to Islam in 1009 and established the Deoghite dynasty. And they really benefited from the Muslim trade routes linking Arabia, Northern Africa, Western Africa. We really see the Songhai stepping into what Mali had established. But under Sunni Ali, whom had taken power there, really fashioned a new dynasty after his name, and that really becomes the Songhai. And so the Songhai then expanded beyond those just smaller borders, taking advantage of their interconnectedness with the other Muslim regions. But it's really under Muhammad Ture, which you can see obviously the change in names. That's because of all the conversions to Islam. And really we see the military commander and devout Muslim. He ends up overthrowing the son of the Sunni and seized power and created a new dynasty, Askia. Now, of course, same kind of internal conflict, internal decay we've seen in other places as people are fighting over who can rule. And we see this in every civilization. We saw it in China. We see it in medieval Europe and Europe in general. We see it in Africa. It's a human thing. Now, after, of course, Muhammad Ture, he ends up dying, and the Songhai entered a slow decline, and ultimately, the Sultan of Morocco gains power. The Sultan, the holder of power, then in Morocco and on the northern coast of Africa, really seizes that dominating control, and so that further western South Africa, right on the hump, really begins to dissolve in importance as Morocco becomes an incredibly important hub of trade for the Mediterranean-African interconnectedness. And so all the wealth is going to shift toward that direction. But we also see, culturally at least, prior to this and throughout this entire period, some major migrations occurring. Particularly as we ask the question of what's going on in East Africa in general and South Africa as we go deeper into those regions. We see a mixture of people that lived inland from the mountains of Ethiopia, and they're largely hunters and gatherers, just like we see all over the world, and particularly in these regions of Africa. You see farming peoples who spoke particular dialects, all connected to a particular language family called the Bantu. The Bantu family of languages really moved from the Niger River into eastern Africa, across that sub-Saharan territory. And it's really their communities that were based on subsistence farming. Now, subsistence farming is really the growing of crops for personal use. So they're not trying to create incredible civilizations through their farming or for their huge surplus, but rather growing it for individual use. And it's really ultimately through iron use for farming that we end up seeing one of the most notable spreads of technology in Africa as well. That they are able to manipulate the melting of iron ore, which is helpful considering all of the abundant resources there. and spreading this technology throughout Africa, along with their language. And we also see, of course, the spread of bananas and yams as well throughout Africa. All, of course, something that occurs with the migrations of peoples throughout the world and in Africa as well. But when we turn our eye to Eastern Africa and the interconnectedness with the Indian Ocean trade network, we see another sort of integrated element. Africa itself is a hub for trade, the northern portion with the Mediterranean. We see, of course, interconnectedness with the Mediterranean Middle Eastern world and Eastern Africa, Egypt. And of course, the East Coast becomes a hotbed for trade with the Indian Ocean. So that eastern coast of Africa became really an important part of the trade network along the Indian Ocean in general. You see the formation of a string of incredibly important trading posts and cities that really emerged under some major places: Mogadishu, Mombasa, Kilwa, all of these incredible centers for trade. We end up seeing really travel narratives being described, particularly the Arab traveler Ibn Battuta, whom called Kilwa one of the most important, beautiful towns in the world. So we could see these urban centers as the product of incredible trade and interconnectedness with these regions that really bolsters their cultural capital, cultural identity, as the entire city really, and the entire nation really ends up gaining most of its culture, much of its artistic culture through those places. Now, ultimately, Kilwa began to decline, and inevitably we'll see, as Europe inevitably crosses into Africa and begins to explore the world, really we'll see the Portuguese sack Kilwa in around 1505, really to quell their attempt at controlling the market and really redirecting all the tension on themselves for them to control all of that trade going on in the Indian Ocean. So we really see a mixed African-Arabian culture in general on the eastern coast, as one might guess, due just to the geographical connection. Inevitably, we end up seeing the rise of Swahili, which is a mixed language of Arabic and Bantu. It's really emblematic of the identity of Eastern Africa at the time. And this really began to emerge throughout those coastal cities, a means by which the Arabs and the Africans would communicate. But we also see various other stateless societies begin to emerge. Really societies that have an identity but no official state in the sense that we think about countries and nations and kingdoms. So in the southern half of the African continent, really we're talking about really stateless societies. States form incredibly slowly, largely due to the fact that it's just incredibly dense, incredibly jungle dense, and so it's going to look completely different. So you see a stateless society is really a group of independent villages that are organized by clans and led by a local really ruler or clan head. So they're interconnected in some sense, but they have no true kingdom or king in the conventional sense that we think of a kingdom. And really these are centered around regions in the south, particularly along the Zambezi River. And you see a mixed economy of farming and cattle herding that really begins to emerge, but you don't see the rise of massive civilizations, massive temples, largely due to the geographical nature of the region and territory. Now, our objectives were: 1, analyze how the expansion of trade led to migration and the growth of new kingdoms, and 2, discuss the different forms of government introduced by rulers.